In the belly of the orbital warforge Tisek, where the clang of steel never stopped and the air always smelled like burnt ozone, Ant-Man crouched beneath a half-melted armor suit. His real name was Tannervoss, but no one called him that anymore. The aliens thought humans were small and fragile, like bugs. So he leaned into it. Ant-Man. Fine. Let him laugh. He was the one keeping their gear from falling apart. Sparks danced off his power welder as he sealed a crack in the shoulder plate. The armor was unlike anything he'd worked on before. Sleek, dense, laced with some kind of living metal that pulsed when he touched it. The kind of tech reserved for elites, commanders, or champions. Maybe even a royal guard. But this one came in barely alive, armor half melted, and no one claimed her. Just another job, they told him. Patch it up and move on. Ant-Man scoffed as he slid out from under the table and glanced at the woman lying unconscious on the repair slab. She was tall, even for a Ritherian. Silver-blue skin, long limbs, and a face like carved obsidian. Graceful and fierce all at once. Her breathing was steady, but she hadn't stirred in hours. He muttered to himself as he scanned the armor's chest piece. Auto-healing lattice, but cracked at the molecular level. Somebody really wanted her dead. His fingers worked quickly, flipping tools in and out of his belt. His work was precise, but he added his usual flair. Tiny upgrades, performance tweaks. Most engineers followed specs. Ant-Man rewrote them. He didn't notice when her eyes opened. They were a shade of violet that shimmered with light, like stars trapped behind glass. She said nothing, just watched. Watched him talk to himself. Watched him tinker and complain. Whoever designed this joint actuator was an idiot, he muttered, unaware she was awake. It's got a kill switch rigged into the elbow. One wrong move, and snap goes your arm. Nice trap. Unless, you like having arms. She blinked. Do you always insult royal engineering while you fix it? Ant-Man nearly dropped his tool. He looked up sharply, eyes wide. Oh, hi, welcome back to the land of the conscious. Don't mind me. I'm just a lowly human grease monkey saving your life. Her voice was calm, but sharp. You're not afraid of me. Should I be? You know who I am. He shrugged. Nope. No one tells the engineer anything. But judging by the armor, the wounds, and the fact you're lying here instead of being paraded through the halls like a war trophy, I'm guessing you're either very important or very dangerous. She sat up slowly. Pain etched across her face, but she masked it quickly. I am both. Well, Ant-Man said, wiping his hands on a grimy cloth. Lucky me. Suddenly, the lights flickered. A tremor rippled through the floor. Ant-Man frowned. That wasn't normal. An alarm began to blare, short, sharp, and only used for one thing, internal breach. She stood fast. They found me. They who? Before she could answer, the door exploded inward. 3 figures in black exo-armor stormed in, weapons raised. Instinct took over. Ant-Man grabbed a plasma cutter and hurled it at the lead attacker's face. It sparked off his helmet, but the queen, because now he knew she had to be a queen, was already moving. Even injured, she fought like fire. And Ant-Man, crawling for cover, realized something else. This wasn't just a repair job. This was war. The blast door buckled inward, jagged metal scraping against the walls as the attackers poured through. They were fast, armored, and deadly. 3 figures in black exosuits, faces obscured by reflective visors. Ant-Man barely had time to react before one of them swung an energy baton, sending a surge of sparks across the room. He ducked behind the heavy workbench, his heart pounding. His hands scrambled for anything he could use, his mind racing. He was an engineer, not a soldier. But in moments like these, you used what you had. He grabbed a power conduit, yanked it loose, and swung it toward the nearest attacker. The weapon sparked as the exposed wires flared up. The figure reeled back, momentarily stunned. "Hey, you want to stop being a jerk?" Ant-Man shouted, his voice betraying his nerves. The attacker's response was a quick blast of plasma, which scorched the air just inches from Ant-Man's head. He winced, diving further behind the table. It was then that he heard her, the Queen, moving. She was silent, but swift. The air seemed to shimmer around her as she flowed across the room. Ant-Man caught glimpses of her as she closed in on the first soldier, a graceful predator. She swung her arm, metal scraping against metal, and the attacker's head snapped backward. He crumpled to the ground like a ragdoll. "Guess you are dangerous," Ant-Man muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. Another soldier moved toward her, his rifle raised. But the Queen was faster. With a precise, fluid motion, she dodged and spun, knocking his gun aside and forcing him into a hold that made him gasp for air. Her strength was unbelievable, even with her injuries. But there was no time to admire it. The third figure, the leader, was already adjusting his weapon. He wasn't going to wait. The moment he pulled the trigger, it would be over. Ant-Man's brain clicked into overdrive. He grabbed a thermal detonator from the workbench and, in one fluid motion, tossed it toward the leader's feet. "Hey!" Ant-Man yelled, drawing attention. "Catch!" The detonator landed with a soft thud. The leader looked down just as the fuse began to hum, sparking bright orange. Without thinking, he lunged for the device, but it was too late. The explosion rocked the room, sending him tumbling backward, his suit smoking and sparking. Ant-Man blinked. He hadn't actually expected it to work. "Guess that's one way to do it," he muttered to himself. The Queen didn't speak. She moved through the wreckage like she was born for battle. Ant-Man watched as she disarmed the last soldier with deadly precision, her grip iron-tight around his wrist, twisting until the weapon dropped. A quick, sharp jab to his throat ended the fight. The silence that followed was deafening. Ant-Man's heart still hammered in his chest as he slowly stood, wiping his hands on his jumpsuit. He glanced at the Queen, who was surveying the room with cool, calculating eyes. She was an enigma. 1 minute, a helpless prisoner. The next, a force of nature. And here he was, some guy who'd spent his life fixing broken ships and gadgets, not exactly equipped for high-stakes gunfights. "Guess I owe you one," he said, offering a wry smile. "Not bad for a human." She didn't smile back. She didn't need to. Her gaze shifted to the doorway, where a series of footfalls echoed. More enemies, or maybe reinforcements. They wouldn't have much time. "I'm not here by choice," she said, her voice steady. "And neither are you." Ant-Man frowned. "You can't be serious. You're a queen. This is your palace, right?" Her eyes flashed as she stepped toward him, her voice lowering. "You think I'd wanted to be here? To hide on a derelict station, repairing armor while my people tear themselves apart?" A sudden explosion in the distance rattled the station, and the Queen moved quickly, gathering her broken armor. "Then what do you want?" Ant-Man asked, frustration creeping in. "A way out." "I want survival," she said simply. "And I need someone who knows how to fix things." Ant-Man raised an eyebrow. "So you want me to save your royal behind again?" She met his gaze. "I'm offering you a choice. Help me, or you can stay here and get used to the idea of becoming a trophy for whoever finds us next." Ant-Man felt the weight of her words. There was something in her eyes that made him pause. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't looking to save anyone. But somehow he knew this wasn't a choice anymore. With a heavy sigh, he nodded. "Fine. But if this blows up in my face, I'm blaming you." She smirked for the first time. "Deal." And in that moment, amidst the wreckage and chaos, Ant-Man realized he had just stepped into something far bigger than a simple repair job. The station's underlevels were a labyrinth of decaying metal, flickering lights, and the hum of ancient machinery. The air was thick with the smell of oil and rust. Ant-Man wiped his brow as he moved alongside the Queen, their footsteps echoing in the hollow silence of the narrow ducts. She moved with the quiet grace of someone who had spent a lifetime in combat, barely breaking a sweat. Heave, on the other hand, was starting to feel the weight of his decision. His back ached from bending low in the tight crawl spaces, his legs sore from the constant crouching, and his mind was racing, trying to piece together the scattered information he'd gotten so far. They'd barely escaped the hangar when more soldiers had shown up, and now they were deep in the belly of the station, with no clear way out. The walls here were thick, reinforced with plating to protect against boarding parties, but the temperature was rising, and the air was growing stale. Ant-Man could feel the sweat trickling down his neck. The Queen, on the other hand, looked unfazed. "Which way now?" Ant-Man asked, his voice low. The Queen paused, her violet eyes scanning the dimly lit passages ahead. "We need to find the comms array. I have to send a signal to my fleet before they realize we've left." Ant-Man's eyes widened. "Wait, your fleet? You mean you've got an actual army behind you?" "Yes," she replied, her tone cool and urgent. "And they won't sit idly by while I'm captured." Her expression darkened at the word, though she quickly masked it with a calm exterior. They moved swiftly through the ducts, Ant-Man's mind whirling with questions. He still couldn't quite wrap his head around the situation. One moment, he was fixing armor for some high-ranking warrior. The next, he was running through a decrepit station with a fugitive queen, with no idea what was waiting for them on the other side. "Why not just escape back to your fleet?" he asked, keeping pace with her. "Because my people will kill me if they know I've betrayed them," she said flatly. "There's no honor in retreat, and right now, there's a civil war raging in my empire. My council would rather see me dead than accept a peace treaty. So much for royal blood," Ant-Man muttered under his breath. She shot him a look, but he could see the hint of frustration in her eyes. She didn't want to talk about it, but he didn't blame her. It wasn't exactly the kind of thing you shared over a cup of tea. Still, he couldn't ignore the fact that this wasn't just some political squabble. This was bigger than anything he'd ever seen. They rounded a corner, and Ant-Man instinctively ducked behind a broken pipe as they came to a stop. The Queen had already pressed herself against the wall, her sharp eyes scanning the hallway ahead. Ant-Man followed her gaze. Two more soldiers, heavier armor, more advanced weapons, were patrolling the corridor. "Looks like we've got company," Ant-Man whispered. She didn't flinch, didn't even hesitate. "We move now." Before he could protest, she was already in motion, her body flowing through the space like a shadow. Ant-Man barely kept up, his movements awkward in the tight duct, as he clumsily tried to match her pace. As they neared the soldiers, Ant-Man's heart thudded in his chest. His mind screamed for a plan, some kind of strategy to avoid being caught, but there was no time. The Queen reached the corner and, without missing a beat, launched herself at the first soldier, taking him down with a swift and brutal maneuver that left Ant-Man in awe. She was lightning, fast and precise, spinning the soldier's rifle away before knocking him out cold with a well-placed strike. The second soldier hesitated, surprised by her ferocity, but it was enough. She moved again, a blur, and his weapon was in her hands before he even had a chance to raise it. In seconds, he was disarmed, pinned to the floor. Ant-Man stood frozen, staring at the two unconscious soldiers. "Damn," he breathed. "You weren't kidding about being dangerous." She stood over the fallen soldiers, breathing evenly. "I've been in worse situations." He couldn't even imagine what worse looked like for her, but right now, all that mattered was getting out. He didn't even care about the Queen's royal status anymore. He was in this deep, whether he liked it or not. "Come on, let's get to the comms," she said, pulling him from his daze. "And stay quiet this time." Ant-Man followed her, the weight of their survival pressing on his chest. The air around them was thick with tension, but there was a strange comfort in knowing she wasn't just an alien royal. She was a survivor, just like him. And somehow, that made this whole mess feel a little more manageable. The comms array was just up ahead, Barely 100 yards through a series of maintenance hallways. Ant-Man's heart was pounding in his chest, but it wasn't from the exertion. It was the gnawing sense of urgency that gnawed at him, like every footstep was a countdown. He kept his eyes on the Queen, who moved with the same deadly grace, her hand never far from the blade strapped to her side. Every now and then, her violet eyes flicked to the shadows, scanning the corners like a predator, ready for any movement. But despite their best efforts, the station wasn't quiet. The buzz of alarms still echoed through the halls, reminding them of their ever-present danger. The low hum of blaster fire in the distance told Ant-Man that they were already behind enemy lines. Again. "We're close," the Queen murmured, voice low but filled with intent. "Once we hit the array, I'll send a distress signal. That's the only chance we've got." "Sounds simple enough," Ant-Man said, but the words barely left his mouth before the air around them exploded. The first shot slammed into the wall beside them, sending sparks flying. The Queen didn't flinch. Her hand darted out, pushing Ant-Man down behind a thick panel. Ant-Man barely registered the movement. His brain was too busy processing the explosion, the blinding flash of light, and the sudden pressure of his heart in his throat. "Get down," the Queen barked, her voice a snap of steel. Ant-Man dropped behind the cover with her, the heat of the blast still radiating against his skin. His mind whirled. He wasn't cut out for this. He fixed things. Patched them up, didn't make them explode. But there was no time for hesitation. "Stay close," she ordered, already moving toward the next corner. He scrambled to his feet, trying to keep pace, but the station was alive with danger now. The enemy soldiers had found them, and they were closing in fast. The sound of heavy boots echoed down the hallway, and the sharp click of weapons charging rang in Ant-Man's ears. 3, maybe 4, he muttered under his breath, counting the sounds, but the Queen was already moving forward. She didn't need the numbers. She needed speed. Before he could even protest, she darted out of cover and launched herself into the open hallway. A figure appeared from around the corner, a soldier, armed with a pulse rifle. The Queen didn't hesitate. She lunged at him, faster than Ant-Man thought possible, knocking his weapon aside and slamming her knee into his chest. The soldier crumpled in a heap, knocked out cold. 2 more, the Queen said, her voice cold, composed, as she wiped blood from her knuckles. Ant-Man felt the familiar burn of panic, but forced himself to move. His feet carried him forward as quickly as his legs would allow, the weight of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just about getting out. This wasn't about armor repairs anymore. This was survival. A second soldier appeared, crouching behind a massive conduit that ran the length of the hallway. He raised his rifle just as Ant-Man dived behind a crate, narrowly avoiding the spray of laser fire. The Queen, as if reading his mind, launched herself at the soldier, catching him in mid-shot, sending him tumbling backward into the wall with a brutal impact. Ant-Man caught his breath as the Queen dispatched the soldier with a quick, lethal strike. He stood up cautiously, watching as she wiped her blade clean. She didn't even break a sweat. "Are you always this quiet when you kill someone?" Ant-Man asked, half joking, half worried. She looked at him, her eyes unwavering. The less noise, the better. They were almost at the comms array, but it was clear now, no matter how fast they moved, no matter how many soldiers they took down, there was no escaping the fight. This was their world now, the station, their prison, and it was going to take everything they had to break free. Just as they rounded the final corner, a loud crack rang through the air. A blast of energy exploded into the side of the wall, sending a shower of debris into the air. Both of them ducked instinctively. "They're here," the Queen hissed. From the shadows, 3 more soldiers emerged, their weapons aimed and locked onto them. Ant-Man could feel the weight of the situation crashing down. He'd faced scrappy bar fights on Earth, sure. But this was another level entirely. The Queen turned toward him, her gaze sharp. "Do you trust me?" Without thinking, he nodded. Do I have a choice? Her lips curled slightly, though the humor didn't reach her eyes. She didn't wait for him to respond, just charged forward, her blade cutting through the air. Ant-Man's heart raced. His mind screamed at him to hide, to find cover, but all he could do was follow, hoping that somehow, together, they'd make it out of this alive. The hallway was a battleground now. Explosions had torn through the walls, leaving deep scars in the metal. Smoke hung in the air like a heavy fog, and the low rumble of gunfire echoed through the station. Ant-Man's ears rang, but there was no time to let it sink in. The Queen was already ahead of him, moving through the chaos like it was nothing, her blade flashing with every strike. The soldiers who had been guarding the comms array were down, but more were pouring in from the shadows, their heavy boots pounding against the floor. Ant-Man's chest tightened. There were too many of them. His mind raced. There had to be a way to. Ant-Man, move, the Queen shouted. Without thinking, he followed her lead, ducking low as they sprinted down the hall. They were close now. He could see the flickering lights of the comms array just ahead. But with each step, the gunfire grew louder, and the enemy seemed to multiply. Get down. The Queen barked, and without hesitation, she threw herself to the ground, pulling Ant-Man down with her. A stream of plasma fire ripped through the space they'd just occupied. The wall beside them shuddered as the blast left a charred scar. The Queen's eyes locked onto the incoming soldiers, 5 of them, charging down the hall with rifles raised. We can't outrun them, she said, her voice steady despite the danger. We fight. Ant-Man nodded, his hands already reaching for whatever tools he had on him. He grabbed a flash grenade and slid it across the floor toward the advancing soldiers. It rolled silently until it exploded in a burst of white light. The soldiers screamed, their eyes burning from the blinding flash. It was all the opening they needed. The Queen surged forward, taking advantage of the confusion, and in seconds, 2 soldiers were down, her blade cutting through their defenses like paper. Ant-Man wasn't far behind. He scrambled to his feet, pulling a blaster from his belt and firing a quick shot at the nearest soldier. The shot didn't miss. The soldier dropped with a grunt, his armor smoking. Ant-Man felt the rush of adrenaline flood his system. This wasn't what he'd signed up for, but there was no turning back now. The Queen had already taken down the 4th soldier, leaving just 1 left. But this one wasn't like the others. He was taller, his armor bulkier, reinforced with extra plating, and his rifle looked bigger, meaner. He took a step forward, his visor glowing faintly. You're dead, traitor, the soldier snarled, leveling his rifle at the Queen. She didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, closing the distance between them in a blur of motion. The soldier fired, but she was faster, spinning out of the way and getting inside his reach. In one fluid motion, her blade sliced through his armor, cutting deep. But the soldier didn't go down. Instead, he managed a last desperate move, slamming his rifle into her side. The Queen staggered back, a hiss of pain escaping her lips, but she recovered in an instant. Ant-Man didn't hesitate. He reached for a nearby wrench and hurled it at the soldier's head. It struck with a satisfying thud, knocking him off balance. The Queen took advantage of the opening, spinning her blade around and driving it into the soldier's chest. He crumpled to the floor, lifeless. Ant-Man exhaled sharply. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but it had worked. The hallway was silent again, except for the low hum of the station's failing lights. He turned to the Queen, his breath heavy. "Damn," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "That was close." She nodded, but her gaze remained fixed on the path ahead. "We're almost there," she said, her voice cold and determined. He followed her, trying to ignore the adrenaline still surging through him. There was no time to feel relieved, no time to catch his breath. They had to reach the comms array. Fast. They rounded a corner, and there it was, just ahead. The comms room, a massive hub of flashing lights and static-filled screens. Ant-Man's heart skipped a beat. They were so close, but something felt wrong. Before he could react, the door to the room slammed shut with a deafening thud, sealing them off from the comms array. The Queen froze. "They know we're here," she said, her voice low, dark. "It's a trap." A sound of boots echoed from the far side of the door. Ant-Man's blood ran cold. They were trapped, and reinforcements were coming. He glanced at the Queen, knowing this was their last shot. "Any ideas?" he asked, the weight of the situation sinking in. She didn't answer at first, her eyes scanning the room. Then she turned to him, her expression hardening. "You said you were good with fixing things, right?" Ant-Man swallowed hard. "I am." "Good," she said, "because we need a way out. Now." The door slammed shut with a finality that seemed to echo through the hollow chamber. Ant-Man's pulse quickened, a deep unease settling in his chest. They were trapped. Across from him, the Queen didn't flinch. Her eyes never left the door, scanning for any sign of movement. Ant-Man could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him. The soldiers outside were closing in. He could hear their footsteps, heavy and deliberate. No escape. No backup. "Okay, so, now what?" Ant-Man asked, trying to keep his voice steady. His mind was racing, but there was no time to think too much. He needed to act. The Queen didn't answer immediately. Instead, she studied the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Her fingers twitched as if she were mentally calculating the odds. It was like she could feel the pressure, the suffocating tension building with every second. "They're coming through," she said, her voice flat. "We don't have much time." Ant-Man ran a hand through his hair. "You said you were good with fixing things," she added. "You better prove it." He looked at her, the full weight of her words hitting him. There was no escape route, no way out without going through the enemy. If he was going to get them both out of here, he had to do it fast. He darted over to a nearby control panel, his fingers flying over the buttons. Sparks flared as the panel sparked to life. There were systems, alarms, locks. He could see the power core schematics, glowing in vivid green on the screen. A few quick calculations told him one thing. The station's main power grid was still running, but it wasn't stable. If he could overload the system, he could fry the circuits and give them a few moments of chaos. But the clock was ticking, and the soldiers outside weren't about to wait. "What exactly do you have in mind?" the Queen asked, her voice calm despite the impending danger. Ant-Man's eyes flicked from the control panel to her, then back to the door. "I'm gonna overload the main power grid. It'll trigger a blackout. The doors should open. And we run like hell," the Queen finished for him, a slight smirk on her lips. He nodded. "That's the plan." Ant-Man pressed a few more buttons. The control panel beeped twice, then the screen flashed red. Sparks shot out, and the lights flickered. He jumped back, instinctively ducking, but nothing exploded. A relief. For now. "System is engaged," he muttered under his breath, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "Now, we wait." The sounds outside were getting louder. Heavy footsteps. The soldiers were almost at the door. Time was running out. "Ant-Man," the Queen said sharply, her voice low. "Get ready." He spun around to face her. Her posture was perfect, poised, like she was waiting for the first sign of danger. Her hand was on her blade again. Ant-Man's gaze dropped to the floor, where the remnants of a few fallen soldiers lay. For a moment, the reality of what they were up against hit him again. This wasn't just a repair job anymore. This was survival. Then the panel beeped again, and the Queen stepped back, her eyes locking on the door. "Hold on," Ant-Man said, his voice barely above a whisper. He pressed the final button, and the screen flashed white. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the entire station shuddered with a low groan. The lights died, and the emergency alarms blared to life, sending red lights spiraling across the walls. The door to the comms room buzzed, and the lock released with a soft click. The doors slid open just as the first soldier's silhouette appeared in the dim red light. He wasn't expecting it. They weren't expecting it. The Queen didn't waste a second. She sprang forward, her blade flashing in the dark. The soldier didn't even have time to react before she had him disarmed, his rifle clattering to the floor. Ant-Man rushed to her side, grabbing a blaster from one of the fallen soldiers. "They'll be back," the Queen said, her voice a grim whisper. "No time," Ant-Man said. "We need to move." They burst out of the comms room and into the dark hallway. Their only hope was the escape pod bay, just a few levels down. But it was crawling with soldiers. The entire station was on alert now. They didn't have much of a window. Ant-Man's mind raced. They had seconds, maybe a minute at most, before reinforcements arrived. The countdown had begun. "Stay close," the Queen said, already moving with lethal precision. "And follow my lead." "Lead the way," Ant-Man replied, gripping the blaster tightly. They sprinted through the corridors, the flashing red lights casting eerie shadows behind them. Ant-Man could feel the weight of every step. If they didn't make it out soon, they wouldn't make it out at all. The station was alive with chaos. The blaring sirens echoed through the hallways as Ant-Man and the Queen raced through the darkened corridors, their footsteps pounding in rhythm. The emergency lights flashed a steady red, casting an eerie glow that made every turn seem like a trap waiting to snap shut. The air was thick with tension. Every moment felt like it could be their last. Ant-Man's heart was in his throat. They were close now. The escape pod bay was just ahead, only a few floors down. But they had no idea how many soldiers were on their tail. The countdown was already ticking in his mind. "We can't outrun them forever," Ant-Man said between breaths, his voice tight with the urgency of the situation. He'd been in tight spots before, but this was different. There were too many unknowns, too many variables. "We don't have to outrun them," the Queen replied, her voice cool and steady, as if this was just another routine mission. "We just need to make it to the pods." "Easier said than done," Ant-Man muttered, but he wasn't about to argue. The mission was clear. Get to the escape pods. Survive. Ahead of them, the hallway split into two. The Queen stopped in her tracks, her eyes flicking between the paths. There was no time for hesitation. Without a word, she took the left path, and Ant-Man followed, trusting her instincts as much as his own. The tension was suffocating now. Ant-Man could feel his muscles screaming, his breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. They were so close, but the sound of footsteps behind them grew louder with each passing second. They were being hunted, and the chase was getting faster. Suddenly, a burst of gunfire erupted from behind. Ant-Man's eyes widened in panic. The Queen was already a few steps ahead, but he wasn't sure if he could keep up. He spun around, raising his blaster, firing blindly at the shadowy figures that were now closing in. The beam shot through the air, hitting one of the soldiers square in the chest. He crumpled, but that didn't stop the others. They were relentless. "Ant-Man," the Queen shouted. Her voice was sharp, and the urgency was clear. "Move." She didn't wait for him. She darted around a corner, disappearing into the shadows of the next hallway. Ant-Man cursed under his breath and bolted after her, the weight of the blaster in his hand dragging him down. He had to stay with her. He couldn't afford to fall behind. As he rounded the corner, the escape pod bay came into view. It was just ahead, only a few more steps. But there was no time to celebrate yet. The door to the pod bay was sealed tight, and in front of it, a group of heavily armed soldiers stood guard. "Not good," Ant-Man muttered, skidding to a stop. The Queen was already sizing them up, her gaze calculating. Her hand was on her blade again, but this time there was a look in her eyes that Ant-Man hadn't seen before, a cold, hard determination. She wasn't just going to get them out of here. She was going to fight her way out. "Stay down," the Queen ordered, her voice low and deadly. Ant-Man didn't need to be told twice. He ducked behind a nearby console as the Queen charged forward, moving faster than he thought possible. She was like a blur, slicing through the first two soldiers with ease. Her movements were precise, controlled, every strike finding its mark. Ant-Man raised his blaster and fired, taking down another soldier in a single shot. The remaining two turned to face him, their rifles trained on him, but the Queen was already there. She swung her blade, knocking their weapons aside, her strikes swift and lethal. In moments, the hallway was silent again. Ant-Man couldn't believe it. The Queen was like a force of nature, unstoppable. But he wasn't about to sit back and watch. They had a job to do, and the window to escape was closing fast. He rushed to the door of the escape pod bay and accessed the control panel, his fingers flying over the interface. Sparks crackled as he worked, and the door shuddered, then slid open with a soft hiss. "Pods are open," Ant-Man said, stepping back, eyes darting around. "But we're not out yet." The Queen was already heading for the nearest pod, her eyes scanning the area. "Get in. Now." Ant-Man didn't hesitate. They had no more time to waste. He jumped into the pod behind her, slamming the hatch shut just as the sounds of reinforcements echoed through the hallways. The station was waking up, and they couldn't stay long. The Queen seated herself at the controls, her fingers moving with practiced ease. The pod hummed to life, and slowly the walls of the station started to shrink away. Ant-Man looked out the small viewport, his chest still tight with adrenaline. They were leaving. They were getting away. But as the station grew smaller in the distance, he couldn't shake the feeling that their fight was far from over. The escape pod lurched as it broke free of the station's atmosphere. Ant-Man watched, his hands gripping the sides of his seat as the station grew smaller behind them, a glowing speck against the backdrop of endless space. The silence in the pod was suffocating after the chaos they had just escaped, but Ant-Man didn't feel safe. Not yet. The Queen, still at the controls, kept her eyes focused on the glowing readouts in front of her. She didn't speak, but there was a subtle tension in her shoulders that betrayed her calm demeanor. Ant-Man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at the small window. There was no sign of pursuit. For now, they were alone in the void of space, but he knew better than to believe they were out of danger. "How long until we're out of their range?" Ant-Man asked, trying to break the silence, his voice steady despite the unease gnawing at him. "Long enough," the Queen replied without looking up. Her voice was sharp, but there was something else there now, something that hadn't been present before, a weary acceptance, perhaps, or the edge of something darker. Ant-Man sat back, the weight of what had just happened starting to sink in. They had made it out, yes, but the cost of the mission hung heavily in the air. He had seen enough to know that this wasn't the end, not by a long shot. "Do you ever take a break from being terrifying?" Ant-Man said with a grin, trying to lighten the mood. He had to admit, he was still in awe of the way she had handled herself. It had been like watching a whirlwind in action. The Queen's lips curled into the faintest of smiles, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I didn't survive this long by waiting for the universe to be kind." Ant-Man chuckled, leaning back in his seat, but the humor didn't last. He knew what she meant. This wasn't some adventure for glory. This was survival. And right now, he wasn't sure if they had fully escaped the storm. The pod's low hum was a constant presence in the background. But now, another sound joined it. A faint beep. Ant-Man straightened, his senses sharpening. Something wasn't right. The Queen's eyes flicked to the monitor, her face tightening. Incoming. Before Ant-Man could react, the pod jolted violently. Alarms blared as the lights flickered, and the entire vessel shuddered with a deep groan. He could feel the acceleration, the sudden force pushing him back into his seat. "What's happening?" he shouted over the sound of the alarms. The Queen was already working the controls, her fingers flying over the console. They tracked us. Not just any enemy, them. Ant-Man's stomach dropped as realization hit. The ones we left behind. She nodded grimly. The Syndicate. Ant-Man cursed under his breath. He'd heard the name before. Everyone had. The Syndicate was a name whispered in fear throughout the galaxy. Ruthless, calculating, and always getting what they wanted. They had no mercy. The pod lurched again, harder this time, sending a shockwave of terror through Ant-Man's chest. He gritted his teeth and braced himself. He wasn't about to let this be the end. "We need to shake them," Ant-Man said, eyes flicking to the Queen. She glanced at him for the first time in what felt like ages, her gaze sharp and calculating. "I was hoping you'd say that." Without another word, she slammed her hand down on the throttle, and the pod shot forward, streaking into the endless expanse of space. Ant-Man's heart raced as the stars outside blurred, the pod twisting and turning with dizzying speed. Behind them, the sound of distant gunfire began to echo. The Syndicate was closing in fast. Ant-Man gritted his teeth, his mind spinning with calculations. There was no way they could outrun them. Not for long. "Hold on," he shouted, his pulse pounding in his ears. The Queen didn't need telling twice. She pulled the pod into a sharp turn, slamming it into an evasive maneuver. The stars twisted into a blur as they dove and twisted between asteroid fields, the ship rattling under the strain. Ant-Man's grip tightened around his seat as the world outside seemed to spin. Then, a sudden flash. Bright, searing light, followed by a sickening thud as a missile struck the side of the pod. The hull groaned, and the pod shuddered violently, throwing both of them forward against the restraints. "Shields at 30%. The Queen said, her voice calm despite the chaos. She worked the controls faster now, her every movement a blur of precision. "Get ready to take them out." Ant-Man nodded, his fingers instinctively moving toward his blaster. "Ready when you are." They were in deep now. No turning back. The Syndicate wasn't just trying to kill them. They were trying to make sure they didn't get away with what they knew. Ant-Man wasn't going to let that happen.